Have you ever wondered what English translation you have and what is that based on? Because if you look at all translations, Bible translations, you will see, obviously it's in English. Then you have a source text from which they translated from. It's either Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and sometimes Latin. So depending on what translation you use, you would have a different language that they base it on. Then there's another format that they translated based on either a word-for-word style, or it's a thought-for-thought, or it's a paraphrase. Obviously, you want to get more word-for-word because a thought-for-thought has a lot of bias and interpretation in those thought-for-thoughts. So what I wanted to do today is actually go through the Bible translations. These are them over here. And by the way, I've actually ranked them in terms of the oldest source from which the English translation. So even though some of these English translations are in the 2000s, they are based on an earlier source text. So the earlier the source text, I started from the beginning over here, and the later the source text is over here at the bottom. Okay, so instead of doing Old Testament and New Testament together, I want to do it separately so that it'll make it a bit more easier and to palletize it. So let me start with the first one. The oldest Hebrew Old Testament manuscript that we have is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what's good about the Dead Sea Scrolls is the fact that it only has 33% of what we have today. It doesn't have the complete. The book of Isaiah is more complete-ish than the other ones, definitely. But what I like about this is, if, for example, I'm debating something. Let's say, for example, I use Psalm 22, verse 16, where it says, where it's referring to the Messiah, and he was pierced in his hands and feet. Now, a lot of the other Masoretic or Hebrew texts have the word lion, like a lion, at the hands and feet. And so you have to ask yourself the question, was it a lion or not? Or was it pierced? Because the translations, when we read it, it says pierced. It was pierced, not like a lion. So when I go to the other Hebrew manuscripts, it says like a lion. So I thought, okay, does the Old Testament the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is about 100 BC, does that have it in there? And guess what? It actually has the word pierced in the Hebrew, not the word like a lion. So you can see that there was some corruption that took place sometime around about 600 to 800 AD, where they took out the word pierced, or they converted the word pierced to lion. And you wouldn't have known this unless you had the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is 100 BC, because obviously the older one will be closer to the source and be better. Another Old Testament source text is the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint was based in 285 BC, and obviously copies were made since then, also known as the LXX. But the source text for this English translation, which is by Brenton, the source text for this, and Brenton did it, by the way, in the 1800s, okay, early 1800s. So he did this, but when he did it, the source text that he used was about a 300 to 400 AD Greek text. And so the Septuagint, what happened was, in 285 BC, there's a bunch of rabbis got together. It was 70 of them. That's why they say 70. Greek experts, and they took the Hebrew at that time, it was 280 to 85 BC, and they translated it into Greek. Okay, and that was for the Alexandrian library. And so since then, they've copied it through the century up until like 200, so 300, 400 AD. And that's what this one is based on. We don't have the old ones, obviously. But this is like a 300 to 400 AD Greek text, right? Another Old Testament one, which this is about a 400 to 500 AD, the source text by Lamza. And 400 to 500, some will say even to 600. And this is the source text that you used was an Aramaic. And this, if someone said to you, what is the first so-called a Bible, the oldest Bible, has English, has Old Testament and New Testament? This would be the Peshitta, right? So the Peshitta had, which is the Aramaic text. And so this has the Old Testament and the New Testament. Obviously, some books of New Testament missing, like one or two of them. But the reality was, this was initially compiled in around about 150 AD. So the full canon that we have wasn't available then. But this translation was based on like I said, 400 to 500. So the other ones were added later on. So he used it. But the source text, which is a 400 to 500, originally comes back down to 150 AD. So again, by the way, it also has pierced. Same with the Septuagint, also has the word pierced instead of lion. So I'm going to skip these, because this is New Testament, and I'll go to this one. Now I just found this one, but recently. It's actually the Quran Tanakh. Now the Quran Tanakh, based on two texts, but the main text that it comprises is of the Aleppo. Now the Aleppo is a 930 AD text, but it's only 60% because other parts are missing. So anything that was missing, they used the Leningrad Codex, which is another Benash text, and this is about 1000 AD. This is, like I said, this is 930 AD. Okay. And by the way, this one has the word like a lion in here. Like I said, this is the Leningrad Codex. Now, this is the JPS, which is the Jewish Tanakh, and this is I would say one of the only English translations that I know of. There might be another one that actually uses all of the Leningrad Codex and translates directly from the Leningrad Codex into Hebrew. One of the only ones that I know. And again, this has like a lion, but everything else is great. You know, the funny thing is, if you had to compare this, which is 1000 AD, to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and say, okay, of the 33% that it has, how accurate is these two? You'll be amazed. This is approximately, when we do the comparison, it's less than 1% deviation. Okay, less than 1%. Which means, and I want to say deviation, I'm talking about, for example, words are different, or there's a change of order of the words. That's different between the Dead Sea Scrolls and this less than 1%. So think of it this is 100 BC. This is 1000 AD. Over 1,200 years, when you compare it, there is less than 1%. They're meaningful. I'm not talking about accents on various things, but meaningful differences where actually we change the meaning somehow. One of them things, as I mentioned to you, was like a lion versus this one has pierced. Okay. So this is 1000 AD. Then you have this one, which is now a Samaritan text. Now, when the word Samaritan, it's also Hebrew, but it's Samaritan Hebrew, still Hebrew. And this text is it's about 1100 AD. Some people will say it's close to 1200 AD, the source text. And it is primarily of the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Bible. the Pentateuch. When you want to compare it, you can actually compare, for example, anything in the first 5 books from here, compare it to the Leningrad Codex, to the Aleppo, you can compare it to the Peshitta, the Aramaic, you can compare it to the Septuagint, and you can compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, if it had it in there, of course. Okay, so this was a Samaritan Hebrew. Then you go on to another book, which is by Wycliffe. Wycliffe is obviously English. By the way, all of these, is English translations, right? So the source text for this Wycliffe is a Latin Vulgate. Now, the Latin Vulgate was about 1,300 AD. And when he compiled it, it was towards the end of about 1,385, around there. That's when he translated it, and even later. So he translated from the Latin Vulgate into English. But if you ever wanted to compare again, the funny thing is, when you look at the Latin Vulgate, it actually has the word for, again, Psalm 22 verse 16 has the word pierced. It doesn't have the word like a lion. The Latin Vulgate goes back to 400 AD when Jerome went to Jerusalem and in Bethlehem, where he transcribed it into Latin. And so that's the Vulgate. But by the way, at the same time, there was another text called the Old Latin Vulgate, or the Old Latin text. And that was around about 180 AD. And they didn't necessarily respect it that much, and that's why Jerome went to go and make sure that it was a good copy. And so he used the original sources to translate it into Latin. And the key thing is, Latin was updated and copied through the centuries from the Latin Vulgate from 400 AD, you could say, all the way up until when he did it, which was 1,300 AD. You also have a copy of the Ethiopian Bible. Now, let me be clear, I don't know of an Ethiopian Bible that is a direct translation from the Ethiopian Bible that they have today. It's always a parts of it. Sometimes you're thinking, is it a King James? They got the books in there, but are they is it a direct translation from the Ge'ez, is the language that they should be translating from? I'm not sure. That's why I put a question mark here. However, they say that this manuscript is about 1,300 around about the AD, and which they were translating from. I don't know how accurate they are. There's a lot of questions about that, but the point is, again, this has additional books in here too, right? It has the Book of Enoch and some other books that are in here. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the Targum. Now, the Targum is a Aramaic text, source text, and it's of the first 5 books of the Bible, so the Torah. And the source text that it translated from into Aramaic was Hebrew. But unlike a lot of the copiers would take a text and then copy it across into a different language. So they look at the text and then translate it. Targum was a little different. Well, in around about 100 to 150 AD, around there, could be even 200 AD, a guy by the name of Cornelius, he would listen to them read the Hebrew, and then he would translate that into Aramaic and then distribute it. The thing is, there are other Targums, but this Targum is probably one of the better ones because it was more of a word for word and it was closer to the time. But again, it's the first 5 books of the Bible. The latest copy of this Targum that we have is 1480 AD, and it's a copies through the centuries existing from about 100 to 200 AD. Okay. So if you said to me, what is the best Targum to use that has the Torah in, I would say use Oculus. Now, this one, as you know, this is not a Bible. Okay, so why is it there? This is Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. The reason why I have it here is because this is also, the source text is Greek. Josephus was a historian during the first century, and he wrote everything in Greek. So he gave a summary to the leaders back in the day. But one thing he did was he spoke about the history from creation up until about 66 AD. And he paraphrased, okay, it's paraphrased, and he left some books out, obviously. But he starts from Genesis, and he writes all the things. So instead of him copying the Bible, he writes it out. So some things he misses, sometimes he keeps in. But the point of the matter is, it's a good reference to see, was this event there? Like if you're reading the Bible and you say, well, let me double check. Does Josephus talk about this? And sometimes he doesn't. But if he does, that definitely affirms that this was one of the things that he wrote down in 100 AD, right? And the oldest, and obviously we don't have the originals, but we have copies. And the oldest copy that we have today is about 1480 AD. That's 82 to 90 AD. Okay, now we get on to Tyndale. Now, Tyndale didn't copy, he was busy with the translation of the Hebrew when he was arrested, so of the Old Testament. He'd already done the New Testament, now he was onto the Old Testament. And so some books are missing, that's true, but there are a lot of Old Testament books that he did translate from Hebrew. Now the text that he used was the Ben Shaim text. Now, the Ben Shaim text is a Hebrew of 1524 was the source text. So he used that text and then he translated it into English. So we have that from Tyndale. But again, like I said, not all of the scriptures because he was arrested. Now, I also have here a complete set of the Ben Shaim text. So it comes in 3 volumes. And as you can see, we'll have the text here. And this is the English direct translation of this text. But the point of the matter is, this is a Ben Shaim, which is a 1524 AD. Now we have the Coverdale version. Now the Coverdale version is 1535. Okay, this is, but the source text that he used is actually, he used Tyndale, because Tyndale, he used Tyndale's New Testament, and he used Tyndale's Old Testament. And then all the gaps, he looked at the German Bible, the Luther Bible, and he because Coverdale understood German and Latin. Those were his main languages. And so he took Tyndale's version, English, he went to the German version and he translated the German into it, and he also took the Latin that he had, and he copied it across. So if anyone said to you, what is the first English translation, it would be the Coverdale. Okay, but it comprises of Tyndale's work, it comprises of Luther's work, and it comprises of his own work using Latin Vulgate. I think we've covered the main source text. You have, just to recap, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, 100 BC. You have the Septuagint copies, which goes to around about 300 to 400 AD. You have Broshuta, 400 to 500 AD, which is in Aramaic. Then you have the Aleppo, 60% of the Aleppo, and that is 930 AD. Then you have the Leningrad Codex, or the Ben Asher as well, known as Ben Asher, and that is 1008 AD. Then you have the Samaritan text, but it's a 1200 AD text. Then you have a Latin Vulgate, and this is 1300 AD. You have, at the same time period, you have the Ethiopian Bible. If it was a copy from that, like I said, it's question mark. It's 1300 AD. Then you have the Targum, which is a 1480 AD copy of in Aramaic. By the way, Ethiopian language is Ge'ez. I have Josephus here, just not as necessarily as a Bible, but more of a commentary or thing to reference. And that's, again, also 1480 AD's oldest copy, but this is based on a 100 AD source. Then you have Tyndale. He uses the Ben Shaim, which is of Old Testament, which is a 1524 AD text. And I think those are the sources. So the modern translations today, they would use, so if you use, for example, ESV, it's none of these. They would use BHS. BHS is, I don't want to say the name because it's too complicated. But the BHS was initially, I think it was 1906 or something like that. That's when they took the various manuscripts. They took Ben Shaim, Ben Asher, and they took the Aleppo, and then they compiled a manuscript. And it was predominantly the Leningrad. Firstly, it was actually the Ben Shaim they used in 1906. But as they progressed, and when they got to 1968, and that's where most of the translations are based on, the modern translations. It's actually from the BHS 1968. And they flipped it around. Now they have a lot of Aleppo, they have a lot of Leningrad Codex, and then very few of Ben Shaim. And they compiled the text. And then all English translations, like the ESV, the NLT, the NIV, etc., they used the BHS. Now, the thing is with the BHS is if you had to compare it to either of these ones, there's some things you're thinking, where did you get this from? Because none of these texts that you have in the BHS is included in here. And I could show you this chart. Hang on, I don't know if you can see this, for example. But you can see this is the BHS, okay? And anything that's green means that's what the Ben Shaim says, but the BHS, look at that, where yellow means deviated from the original source. It's deviated. So there's a number of verses where it's deviated. And I only took about 13, I believe it was 13 verses to compare it. So the BHS, I have big question marks on it, and I would stay away from the BHS. And so that's why I like looking at the original sources, because again, the BHS still required somebody to bring in the different manuscripts and make decisions. I want to avoid those decisions and say, let's just go back to the copying of the source. Don't collate them for me. Just tell me what the sources were, and then the translation. So this one was one of the first ones where they did that on the Aleppo, but it was only two texts. The Aleppo, which is 60% what they had, and then 40% was the Leningrad Codex. So not such a big deal. So what I am saying is we have amazing source texts that you can actually find in English translation of the source text, and use those if you want to study the Old Testament in details. So I think that wraps it up for the Old Testament.